this session, really, the focus was on sort of how to evangelize and how to impact your culture. And I think every one of you here right now would actually, before I get in, just a small thing. I'm going to try to leave 5 minutes at the end for Q&As. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about sort of the things that I do organizationally and personally to live out my faith. Obviously, I practice medicine, so I have a lot of interaction with people. I spent 18 years of my life practicing emergency room medicine for kids, pediatric ER, and then a year ago I transitioned to telemedicine. And so I'm constantly sort of in the world, and how does that, people always want to know more about that. So if you have questions about how that works out, we can do it at the end. You're going to see in a minute, I'm not here to give you practical advice, really. I feel compelled to open God's Word and show you a life of a man. We're going to cover this sort of like overview of the book of Daniel. If you have your Bibles, get them out, turn to Daniel. I really believe that God has the answers to everything that we ever have thought about, imagined, any question that comes to our mind when it comes to relating to our culture. And so rather than thinking about, hey, what are some strategies that can help you go out in the world? You're a doctor. How do you evangelize? I'm going to tell you how. I look at people like Daniel, and I see how he lived his life, and I try to model my life accordingly. And I try to model my life in a way that pleases the Lord, and I try to let him change me inside and out. And that is how we all believe, I think, or we wouldn't be here at a Moody conference on a Saturday where it's 65 degrees in Chicago. You'd be like, we're coming, all right, see you all later. I'm going to go shop for a few minutes, have a nice lunch, and come back. But you're here and looking outside going, no, you're actually not looking outside. I am. But I really believe that the model of Daniel is the biblical model to impact your culture. Now let me give you a little bit of a background of Daniel. You guys know the story of Daniel, but this man was taken into exile. He's in the first group that was taken into exile. So he's like taken into slavery, basically, by the enemy. And so it's just like, we can't even wrap your mind around it. But like, think of the Syrian war. If you're a Syrian young man who's taken into another country, you're out of your element. You're with a group of people that are your people, but you sort of look around kind of wondering, like, what world have I been stuck in? And he's grown up in a Jewish home, and we know, because we see how his life plays out, so we know that Daniel had a background of knowing what the Word of God is and what God wanted for his people. And we're going to see in a minute that he is in a setting where he has to declare how he's going to live. And we're going to see some patterns in the person of Daniel that will distinguish him from all the other young Jewish boys who were taken into exile in that time. And he was the cream of the crop. So this guy had everything going for him. He was a leader. He was young, but he had everything going for him. And we're going to see in a moment how throughout his life he stayed true to God's Word. How? How does that work out where you're in a completely heathen world? Again, it's going to draw so many similarities to where we live right now. So you're in a heathen world, and you're in a strange land, and you've been wronged, so you're not treated fairly. My first reaction would be, God, how could you do this to us? Are you even believable? But Daniel doesn't go there. And we're going to see in a moment some characteristics of Daniel that distinguish him so that, listen, he ends up changing his world. And he does not do it through social media platform. He does not do it through writing books. He does not do it through any of those things that we in American Christianity have now deemed like adequate activities for Christians to change their world. He doesn't get into debate with anyone. You don't see him debating anyone ever in the book of Daniel. But we see certain things about his life that make him the ideal candidate and person that God can step in and say, all right, Daniel, you're my man. And he doesn't just change his world, he changes his world. You say, what did he do? We're going to see 4 things, just 4 points in this teaching. I warn you, if you're coming in the afternoon, I think there's like 7 or 8 points in each session, so you're going to get off easy today. But I want to just kind of walk through his story and tell you what he did. And oh, here's my notes. Sorry about that. Those are important, or I wouldn't save them in my Bible. So number 1 is this: how to impact your culture. You cannot impact your culture without your resolve to be set apart from the world. Write that down. If you've got a pen, if you've got a paper, 4 simple points that I urge you, I beg you to go home tonight and read those 4 points and consider in your life, are you living a life like Daniel? You say, how does that work out? Well, Daniel chapter 1, I'm not going to read all of the verses, but maybe we'll start to give us a little context here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Babylon was worshipped not God, but Babel, the idol. And so he comes over, they come to Jerusalem, they besiege it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This is a bad day for the people of Israel who had been warned by God that this was going to happen. But they didn't listen, they kept rebelling. And we know that pattern of God being faithful to them and them being absolutely rebellious to him, even though he poured his mercy and his grace on him over and over again. Again, very much like the land that we're living in right now. My family moved from Lebanon to Green Bay, Beirut, Lebanon, to Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1987. I mean, that is messed up, right? And now I live in Chicago. What is wrong with us? And so I'm a huge Packers fan. You can make people believe anything you want, by the way. People always ask, like, why did you guys move to Green Bay? And we would come up with all kinds of stories. Like, my dad was a coach for the Packers. Like, he's Lebanese. Like, really? People actually believed us. And we had fun with it. My dad was a huge Packer fan. He died 4 years ago, and he indoctrinated all of us. But that's neither here nor there. Where was I going with this? I always start on these stories, and I'm like, where was my point? But we moved from... I really can't remember. So we're going to go back to task here. It'll come up... No.
He was a Bears fan.
No Bears. No. Now I'm constipated. I'm just kidding. All right, so we're talking about, let me go back to the verses. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them, I was talking about just this difference. So we were talking about our culture, the United States. See, the thread is there, it just needs to be brought back. We came to the United States thinking that this is a Christian country. It was an attractive thing for us to be here. We grew up in a I guess Lebanon is sort of a mix. It's like, it used to be about 45% Christian, 55% Muslim, and over the years now it's probably like 35, 65. It's hard to know for sure. And when I say Christian, I do not mean evangelical Christian and God we trust. I just mean Christian, some form of Greek Orthodox Catholicism, people who go to church on Easter and Christmas. And so that's our setting. My mom comes to Christ in college, and she comes to Christ. By the way, do you need missionaries to come to Jesus? The answer I can tell you in case you're all shaking your head, no, you don't need a missionary. You need the Lord. Yes. She did not have a missionary savior. She was in college, a secular university, the American University of Beirut, in a philosophy class. And she's reading the Existentialist, and the reading assigned to them was the Confessions of St. Augustine. And she's in her mid-20s, and she comes across that sentence in that book. John Piper always talks about how it is not books that change us, but sentences that change us. And the sentence that radically changed her life was that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And she was radically converted. And around that time, this is how God providentially works. You say, how do you impact your culture? You do so much, but then God comes in and God does something that we can't even put words to. And so the missionaries of the Navigators were at the college at that point. And right as she gives her life to Jesus, they meet her up and they get her into church, and she gets discipled. And the other day, I got a woman who came across a study that I had online who sent me an article of a Christian women's Bible study back in Lebanon where my mom was doing a special guest thing 2 or 3 years into the faith. None of her family members were followers of Jesus. In fact, they resented that she had followed Jesus. They thought that she had betrayed their background. They were Palestinian refugees back from the 1940s. And here she was now going to sup with the Judeo-Christian Church of America that was sort of confusing to them, and yet she stayed true to the Word of God. And so I grew up very much spoiled, much like many of us here, where it was like a regular church, Bible Sunday school setting. And then we moved in 1987 thinking that this is the land of the missionaries and this is the land of faith. And maybe it was for a year or 2 or 5. And slowly our culture has eroded to where now when you read about Babylon, you see a world that is very much like what we have in the United States now. You don't have to be a church leader to wake up and go, man, there's something amiss in our country. And I know, just this week I read an article of people saying, there isn't a lot happening spiritually. There is, but there's a definite shift in our world, in the way that our world functions here in the United States, to where now we no longer just talk about putting our faith in Jesus, but everything has to be analyzed, and everything has to be beat up, and everything has to be a side. You're either on this side or on that side. And then you land in it, and much like Daniel, you look around and go, man, what world have I landed in? And the risk is to retreat so much into yourself. They'd be like, well, I'm going to draw a line right here. And there's the world, and I'm in my little cocoon of Christianity right here, and I'm not going to have a conversation about all this. And maybe a conversation is not what you need. Maybe what you need is what Daniel did. And so in verses 1 through 7, we're told how these young men who were taken into custody, into this slavery, really, and the king assigns them a daily portion of food. So he's trying to treat them well so that he can use them basically against their own people down the road. And so he educates them and he lures them into their ways. And of course, among those were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. So Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah called Shadrach, because you know these guys, Meshach and Abednego. Daniel, here it is, verse 8. You cannot impact your culture without your resolve to be set apart from your world. You say, what did Daniel do right here? He was a young, maybe 16, 17-year-old. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He made a decision. I'm going to be different. He made a decision. He didn't say, man, I'm going to just go and talk to everybody about my faith. He says, no, I'm going to look inwardly and say, God, what is it? How is it that you want me to live? That might be a little bit odd. That might be a little bit unusual. That might create a stir. That might put me at risk. But I'm going to live that way because that is your way, Lord. That is a way to honor you. And so he decided that he wouldn't eat of the king's food for a number of reasons. One, it was food, of course, in a foreign land. But there was also some Old Testament laws that he was trying to follow. And so he asks the chief of the eunuchs and puts himself at risk. He says, please allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor. And so here's where, again, you make a decision for God. You see God come in and do an element of work that you can't even explain. Many of you can testify of that. You go to work, you tell them, here's why I do what I do. And I remember back in the 80s and 90s, people used to say, well, I'm not going to work on Sundays. And you would go to work and tell them, and they'd be upset about it. Now it's like unheard of. You're fired if you can't work on Sunday, unless you work at Chick-fil-A. And if you work at Chick-fil-A, you're going to be all over the news. Come on. Not in a good way either. But mind you, God is being glorified.
Yes, He is.
You see it. You see it. And so there's favor somehow. Everybody knows there's no chicken sandwich like Chick-fil-A's. I asked my 5-year-old nephew, where do you want to go to lunch today? Chick-fil-A. And I'm like, aren't you sick of it? No, they have the best chicken in town. It's God's favor. It's God's favor. You say, man, you're being a little weird. That's so Christian weird. Really? Because all I see is negativity about the company, and yet they're still being talked about as being, well, their service is amazing. Anybody ever stood in that line? I don't know if there are followers of Jesus who stand on the line. To me, they look like high schoolers, but they sure treat me with regard. They smile. That's saying a lot. Most people in the United States are so angry right now. And you get into the line.
I have a little Chick-fil-A story. The first time I went was in Denver with my grandson, and I said, I've never been here before. We don't have one where I live. So then I went and I placed my order, and they said, this is your first time. You can't pay. We're going to give this to you for free.
Dude, man, that's a great strategy. I'm going there tomorrow. I get it free tomorrow. That's awesome. That's praise God. And so here's Daniel. So he makes this decision that is culturally unacceptable in a sense. I mean, here's a king you're a slave, you're nothing, and the king makes a decision to feed him, and he's like, I don't want it because of my God, and yet God gives him favor. And again, Chick-fil-A is sort of an illustration that we can sort of wrap our minds around. But now think about your life. What is it that is setting you apart from the people in your culture? Look, I don't have a list of 10 things that if you do these things, that makes you set apart. What does it mean to be set apart? You want to know how to impact your culture. You start thinking about that, not about what am I going to tweet in the next week so that I can make attention so that God can be glorified. God doesn't need you to tweet for Him. Yeah, He's got enough words in this book. If you start tweeting about Him, all it's going to do is create fighting with the people in your life that don't agree with you anyway. But maybe it's time for us to stop and say, God, how can I be set apart? And listen, your decision might be different than your decision might be different than yours. I don't know what your dynamics are. We know what holiness is. We know there are certain things that are no-brainers. And then some are simple things, financial decisions that you make. And maybe you don't put your kids in soccer because you want to go to church on Sunday. And putting them in that soccer program takes you away from Christ's body. I don't know what it is for you. Is it sinful to play soccer on Sundays? Depends who you ask. Yeah. Right? I mean, I don't know. We're gotten so adjusted to the ways of the world that we're like, no, it's not. I mean, it's their hobby. They're using their talents. We can go to church on Saturday. I get it, but maybe it is for your family. Maybe you've just assumed that it's okay to live like the world. What do you listen to on a regular basis? What do you watch on a regular basis? You say, what was the big deal about food? Did God not create food for us to eat? Of course he did, but Daniel saw an opportunity. Listen, this wasn't about food. This was about his heart and his priorities. And his heart was that, God, there is a way that leads to life. And Daniel, as a young man, knew enough from the way that he was brought up. And listen, I have nephews right now who are teenagers. It's not easy bringing up nephews who are I don't even bring them up. I'm watching from afar, thank God. I text my mom at least once every 2 weeks. Thank God I didn't have any kids, because this does not look easy. You can't force them, but imagine a world where your kids grow up. If you have kids who are going through, I see the struggles that teenagers are going through, even teenagers who are brought up in a godly home. If you have kids who are making decisions like this, and here's Daniel who's asking the question, God, how can I be different? You want to impact your culture, you just start living differently. It might mean I spend a lot of time now in Lebanon and reaching out to people in the Middle East, specifically Syrian refugees. About 5 years ago when the crisis broke out, I saw an opportunity. The Lord had me in transition in my work in the ministry here in the United States. And I thought for a minute that I couldn't see what else I would do in ministry. Many of you are in ministry, or leaders in ministry. And I remember just sort of looking at my life and thinking, God, I think the ministry's done as I know it. And I just didn't have any hope that there was another chapter. And God used that season. If you're in a season of nothing, by the way, this is a great place to be. Because it's a place where God can be like, finally, I got your attention. And he's like, you're trying to go this way. I've been trying to get you to go this way. And so I started taking these trips to the Middle East and asking the question, God, what else would you have me do? You haven't killed me yet, so there's clearly more service for me here on this earth. That's an encouragement to some of you here who might be in limbo right now going, I don't know what ministry. Maybe you used to be the women's ministry director at your church, and now you have nothing. And you go, I don't know what in the world I'm doing here in this world anymore. I've asked that question. I've uttered these words, and they're born out of a sense of, God, really? And we must pay attention to those words and say, God, I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing it clearly. And perhaps God is trying to guide you to another way, to impact another place. I believe God's heart is to reach people who don't know him yet. And so rather than staying in circles where everybody's heard it a million times, he wants to move us into directions and places where we need to be light in the darkness. And so for me, it was like a situation where 1 + 1 = 2. I'm Lebanese. I speak Arabic. 2 million refugees went to Lebanon. I'm a doctor. I can take care of people. So 2012 rolls around and the refugees show up to Lebanon and I'm in limbo and I go, God, what else could you have me do in this life? I wonder. And then my friends called me up and said, hey, we're going to Jordan. Do you want to come with us? I said, I got nothing else to do. Yeah, I'll go. I go to Jordan and I start seeing the refugee life and I think, man, I don't know what I could do here. Have you ever looked at a mountain of world that you're like, I don't even know how I could impact this? And then I came back and I went to Lebanon and came back, and 2 or 3 trips into it, God started shaping a vision. This last week I came back from Lebanon after our 9th medical mission trip, working with Syrian refugees. In 1 week we saw 1,050 people. These people, we have opportunities to pray with them in the clinic. They have a constant relationship with the people in the church. And I've noticed as I've studied sort of this environment, the pastor of the church is Lebanese, and he didn't go to Lebanon to be a missionary to the Syrian refugees. God doesn't usually work this way. He just plants you where you are. And so back in 2002, this church, this pastor, he was actually working at another church in Beirut, an hour away from where most of the refugees are right now. And he got a call before, this is 2002, there was nothing, Syrians were in their glory. Syria used to be, if you know anything about Syria or any of the politics over there, they used to be very much flourishing. In fact, they were they came into Lebanon, and they were sort of an enemy of Lebanon back during the 70s and 80s during our civil war. And so the way that the civil war ended in Lebanon was that they sort of shut us up. They came in, the peace was obtained, and 5 or 6 or 7 years later, the Lebanese said, no, we don't want the Syrians in charge. And so he kind of took back over, and there's a lot of politics in that, a lot of martyrs in the whole thing. And by 2000, Lebanon was sort of, on its own now, but they had sort of a resentment to the Syrians. So here's this pastor who was asking the question, God, what would you have me do in my life? And he felt a stirring in his heart, like, God, there has to be more. And how do I reach more Lebanese? And he's praying and seeking ways to impact his world. And this guy, talk about being set apart in every way. He's a computer engineer. And he's serving in his church because he feels called to it. And he doesn't know what that looks like. And one day, as God providentially does, he gets a phone call. And he says, hey, we heard about you. And we think you should, we have a couple of guys here in Zahle, this town. And we think you should come up and tell us about Jesus. And so he's like, okay. So he gets in his car, drives an hour, shows up to this apartment, and there's like 50 people waiting to hear about Jesus, most from a Muslim background. These were Lebanese. So they start the church there. They have no concept that there will be Syrian refugees walking into their doors 12 years later. And for this whole time, he's set apart in every way. I said to him, tell us about those early years. He's like, you don't understand how hard they were, their impact in their eyes. They looked at their life. You ever look at your life and you look and go, how much impact am I having? He was like on the negative scale. They did the church for 2 or 3 years, and by the end of the 2 or 3 years, those people who were coming to Christ were moving away. They would leave Lebanon for a variety of reasons like we had, and so the church was dwindling. So he hit a crisis, and all he had was personal holiness. And he would just be set apart. He lived in a way that others in the country were not living, and he consistently made decisions that were set apart, that were very much Christian in a world that was not. He tells about one day, just this last week, he told me a part of his story that I didn't know. He goes, late 2000s, or before 2010, he hit a crisis mode where he couldn't see any impact. He thought, what am I doing here? And he says, I got stuck. There was a snowstorm in the town. His family was in Beirut, so he had an hour to go. He couldn't go because there's a mountain in the middle. So he had the cars, everything, the roads were shut. They don't have plows like they do in Chicago. So this guy is stuck. He didn't have a car in Zahle. He says to me, like 35 days. He goes, all I did was pray. In fact, that's my second point. You can write that down. You cannot impact your culture without learning to pray. You say, what did Daniel do? Well, we saw how he was set apart, and then we see, I'm going to come back to Pastor Jihad's story in a second, but let's look at Daniel for a minute. So he resolves not to eat food. God gives him favor, and of course, many of you here are familiar, your church leaders, you know the story of Daniel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in essence, he does better than the people who hadn't resolved not to eat meat. So the meat eaters are like, we're so strong, and the keto, people are like happy, and, right? You got to drop in the word keto at some point in the teaching. I'm on the keto diet, in case anybody's wondering, and so of course that's the bad guy, the keto diet. The vegans are like, hey, we're winning. The keto's like, oh, this is bad. So they come up at the end, and whatever their diet was, God gives a blessing to Daniel and his buddies. Of course, you know that when he decides to be set apart, he doesn't impact everybody, but he impacts 3 people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to see how, as they too are set apart, God uses them. I'm not going to get into them very much, but we know that a whole chapter in the book of Daniel is dedicated to those 3 men and how God used them in the fiery furnace. How many of you have not been impacted by those 3 men today? How many of you have not heard that Casting Crowns song or Mercy Me song? Even if, and every time you hear it, you're like, yes! 2019. We got nothing to do with Babylonian culture. You say, how do you impact your world? You decide not to eat meat because you want to stick out in the culture. This isn't about beating people with your 3 beliefs about, whether you're reformed or not, or whether Jesus is coming back before or after the tribulation. This is not theoretical. This is practical holiness. And they don't draw a line and say, man, we're sitting on this table because we're the veggies here and you guys are the meatos here. And they don't do that. Like they're part of the community, but they're just disdained. They're mocked. They're looked down upon, but they don't care because they know why they're doing it. They're not doing it for show. They're doing it for obedience. Now, they had another weapon, though, in chapter 2. As you get into the story, you know that after they come out strongest, you start seeing the ripples of impact. They're not really like explosive yet, but they're starting. The king takes note of them. They're like looked well upon. Well, now they put them as wise men, and so they're put in a room along with all the wise men. And then what happens? Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And nobody can answer it because he's like, you got to interpret a dream or else. And so Daniel's like, what's going on? And then they're told there's a problem. The guy had a dream. We've got to interpret it. And he doesn't tell them the dream. And they're supposed to figure out the dream. And the whole thing is a mess. The guy's crazy. Well, we all know about crazy leaders. On both sides, by the way, on both sides of the bar, I don't care what side you're on. Listen, if learn anything from being Lebanese, is that politics is there. I do not want to touch it. Listen, it destroyed our country. It destroyed my country of Lebanon. To this day, there's instability in our country because of politics. And one rule in the local church in Lebanon, they say you cannot talk politics. That's it. You can talk about anything else, just don't talk about politics because it divides. So how do I connect with people if you don't talk about politics? Guess what? You talk about Jesus. Amen. That's what they're doing over there. It's amazing. I see these pastors, I see these church members, people who just a month ago received Jesus into their heart, and a year ago, Muslims who have given their life to Jesus, and you go, what are they doing with their free time? They're discipling other people into their Christian faith. It's crazy. They've got this small group model that would put most mega churches to shame. 90% of their people are ex-Muslims who got saved in the past 4 years. It blows your mind. You go, where are they meeting? You talk about cell groups. You want cell groups? They've got them all over the camps. They've got people from the camps coming to the church. They've got meetings for the Muslims. They're hungering, running after Jesus. They pray. So here's Daniel. He says in chapter 2, verse 7, Daniel's like, he sees what the problem is, so he goes to his house and made the matter known. He brings his prayer team. How many of you have a prayer team? If you do not, raise your hand if you do. Everybody should have one. If you do not, you go home and you find a prayer team. You say, man, you don't get it. I'm single. I don't know anybody in my church. Nobody talks to me in my church. I don't have any friends. I get you because that's me. One day, 6 or 7 years ago, I get an email from a woman. I used to blog regularly. Now people tweet. But back then, it was like you wrote something every day. And I don't know why anybody read anything that anybody else wrote, but they did. And one woman emailed me and says, I follow your blog. I want to pray for you. And I thought, okay, stand in line for the amount of people who say that. She emailed me again. And she says, no, I'm serious. Send me your prayer request. She goes, I know this sounds weird, but I'm serious. I want to pray for you. So I thought, well, I'll take her up on it. Sent her some prayer requests. A week later, she sent me another email. 6 years into it, I talk to her once a week. I've never met her in person. I do not go speak anywhere. Irina knows that. I do not go speak anywhere without telling Heidi, I need, last night, yesterday in LA, I spoke outside of LA. I took the overnight to be here today. And that was a God thing, by the way. I was so excited to be able to go. It was a very last minute thing. Someone got sick who was supposed to be there. God worked out the details. But last night I was there and I'm like, man, I need prayer. And I text Heidi and Heidi's like, I can talk now. Calls me up. She lives in Racine, Wisconsin. There's like 3 cows in Racine. There's nobody lives in Racine. She's got like a husband and 3 kids, and she's adopted 3 kids. She's as far as the east is from the west as I am. You look at her life and you say, what is she impacting? You ask me what she's impacting. Every bit of fruit that I will ever lay at the feet of Jesus has to do with Heidi and her prayer in my life. We are so limited in our ability to see clearly. We think if we don't have we're told, listen, our Christian industry tells us if you don't have a big enough platform, you'll never matter. That's rubbish. There's more kingdom work done by people that we'll never meet here on this earth. I can talk about this for a week. If we had enough time, I'm telling you, it's destroying leaders in the church. Like you will wake up and feel like your work will matter. Many of you have Bible studies in your souls that you want to teach your women, but you'll feel compelled to do one because they're famous, because nobody will come if you'll teach. That's rubbish. You just get into the Word and you pray and you do what Heidi did, and you do it for each other, and you do it all the time, and you do it when you don't see the fruit. And listen, for every Heidi, there's a Lina wanting to quit, who says, Heidi, I don't see it. All I do is pour myself out. I'm tired. I'm lonely. And Heidi gets on the phone and says, stop that. That's Satan's attack. Amen. You open your eyes and see clearly. Lina, we fight this war. You keep on going. Oh, she'll listen to me rant, but she won't take it. She's godly. I used to call my mom. My mom got sick of me. I'm Lina Heidi. That's serious. My mom now she's like 78. She can only handle so much. You know, there's a point where, you know, like, your parents are getting a little older. She only wants good news. Like, she just does not want to know if I get a speeding ticket. I didn't tell her I was going to LA, coming back on the overnight. So yesterday I called her up because I call her every day. And she's like, what is that in your background? I'm like, Mom, I thought you had cataracts. I don't want to worry her. I'm like, oh, you know, I just came to, I'm in LA. She's like, what are you doing in LA? You're crazy. You never rest. That's your mom. Heidi's like, I'll pray for you. Daniel prayed. Daniel prayed. He seeks mercy. This is his plan. You say his plan in the face of the impossible. This is an impossible task. Do you understand? Who can tell the king what he's dreaming and what the interpretation is? And yet Daniel is not daunted. He says, he goes to his friends and he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. And then he gets it and he prays there. Blessed be the name of God. You read his prayer. And then it says, and the king brings him to Daniel. He says, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered and says, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. Now listen, Daniel has learned who his God is. See, Daniel has not forgotten the God who helped him when he took a stand, when he resolved to be set apart. He did not overlook what God had done. He remembered. Our biggest problem sometimes is that we forget. We forget what God has done. Yesterday's blessings are forgotten in our mind. And God is constantly like, don't you forget it, because the same God who was faithful to you yesterday to bring you to where you are today is working in you now to get you to where he wants you to be tomorrow. And so Daniel knows that. So he comes to the king with confidence, not because he's such a great prayer warrior. I've yet to see someone say to me, man, I am great at prayer. I've yet to meet that Christian. Pastors, small group leaders, everybody's preface. This is our biggest struggle in the Christian life. Man, I don't know how to pray. No wonder the disciples, that's the main thing they asked Jesus. How do you pray? Our prayers feel inadequate. The answers seem so far. Is it any wonder that Romans, God says, the Spirit makes intercession for us. You don't have to be a mighty prayer warrior. You have a God who's a mighty prayer warrior. Yes. He's fighting on your behalf. You just dig in, you show up. Sometimes there's no words in your prayers. Other times you can't stop talking. You lament to God. You rejoice with the Lord. You do what the psalmist does. We feel like we've got to put on our Sunday best to God. And if we can say the prayer right, he'll hear us. And if we say enough in your will, God, he'll hear us. And then we'll impact our world. God's like, I just need your heart. Amen. And so Daniel has learned these lessons. And so now he says to the king, no one, no wise man, no enchanter, no magicians can show the mystery. But here it is, verse 28. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar. You want to impact your world? You start praying for boldness, for moments like this. Remember Esther? They prayed. And what did she do? She went before the king. She says, I might die. But on the other hand, God might answer our prayers. Her faith was not as strong as Mordecai's. And she showed up maybe fully expecting that the king would boot her out of there. But instead, he opened the gates and he brought her in. And of course, we know the story of Esther. And everybody now likes to quote, for such a time as this. But listen, in your life, it is the same. God is preparing you and me for such a time as this. Every day may not be that time, but it's coming. We know about Daniel 2 things so far. One, he separated himself from the rest by living obediently to God. Two, he prayed. We don't know how much time went in the middle. We don't know whether he was homesick. You better believe he was homesick. We wonder, was he praying about returning to his homeland? I bet you he was. This young man whose family was away from him. I wonder what he worried about. I mean, he's a human. This was not Jesus. He was human like us. But he was committed and resolved to impacting his world. And he knew that he couldn't do it, but that God in him could do this. And so now he's given a meeting before the king, and he's able to say, King, here's the deal. And he gives him, of course, we know that he gives him the answer. And just to wrap up back with Pastor Jihad's story. So here's Jihad. He's in Zahle. This is in the late 2000s. He's discouraged. His impact, all these people that had asked him to come and start this church are now gone. So the church looks like he's like, God, I didn't, come drive an hour every Sunday to meet for this. And he's frustrated. And I said to him, what did you do? He goes, I was stuck in this place for 35 days. I couldn't get back to Beirut. It was the worst snowstorm. He goes, all I did morning to evening, I would get up and walk in Zahle and pray and walk and pray. And I wrestled with God, and I walked, and I prayed, and I walked, and I prayed. And he goes, finally, one day I was praying, and I can't remember the verse that God gave him, but he says it was like I looked up, and there was all these clouds, and then the sun shone through, and he felt in that setting as he was reading the word and praying that God had spoken to him and says, I see you, I know, you just stay committed here. And so he says after that, he was so rejuvenated, he felt like he had a really personal encounter with God. After 35 days, God help him. I mean, I would hope so. I would have lasted 33 minutes. And I would have thought I was like an Ironman, right? Like I'm a triathlete, whatever, like 33 minutes with God. This guy, 35 days. And he goes, then we still didn't have a ride. He goes, but I just decided I'm going to walk back to Beirut. So he walks, literally the guy walks like 50 miles through the mountains to get back home. And he starts coming back with a new heart attitude. He's like, God, I don't know how it's going to change, but I trust you. And he feels this rejuvenation of his spirit. Impact-wise, no change. This is mid to late 2000s. 2010, he starts just serving, and God starts rebuilding like a new season of discipleship. And again, the Lebanese people coming, and some growth, but again, nothing dramatic. And then answers to prayers. They were given a land. They built a church. Just some miraculous things that happened. And out of that, 2012 rolls around. The week that they were booted out of the apartment where they used to meet, their church building wasn't done yet. They had an auditorium that was being built. The only thing that was done was the basement had a room, and it was done. And they were like, well, the guy wants us out of his apartment because his son is getting married, and he needed the apartment to put his son in. And so the pastor at first was a bit miffed, like, I can't believe after all these years of renting this apartment for church, now we've got to move. But they were like, well, we've got the basement, so we'll meet in the basement. They literally go and meet in the basement, and the next Sunday, 1,000 refugees show up to their doors. The Lebanese didn't plan on that. The church didn't plan on it. But they had prayed that God would allow them to reach those who needed the gospel. He had prayed. I say we hear his stories, and time does not allow me to tell you the miraculous that they have seen in the Middle East. And he'll tell you the sense over and over again. He goes, Lina, we've learned to walk on our knees. He goes, we've learned to walk on our knees. This is how they impact their world. You say, what's happening in the Middle East right now? See, so we used to think of this country as that country of missionaries. And do you know that when I go to the Middle East, by the way, most of the people who are coming to serve in the church are from Egypt. Egypt, the land where Christians are persecuted. You hear about it in the news. And yet they're sending hordes of people to come and disciple the Muslims. The Muslims there's a service at 12 o'clock that is full of over 100 Muslim people, mostly women with covered heads who have heard nothing about Jesus, and they come to the service because they want to know about the light of Christ. People are I went to visit families in my 1 week. We had multiple visits, and you say, what are you talking about? We would sit down, and I would be like small talk because we're like American evangelism, like get to know them, befriend them first. And then the pastor who was with me, the discipleship pastor who I work on the ground, he would like, this guy's crazy. You think I'm high energy? He makes me look like a worm. This guy's something. When it's yes together, everybody runs. And so he would drop me off with a group, go take the other group to another home, and then come back. And so he'd walk in on a conversation, and I'm still on like, so how many kids do you have, right? I mean, I'm just like easing my way into, are they a red apple or a green apple? You know, pulling out your evangelical exposure. And the guy would walk in, interrupt the conversation, go, do you know Jesus as your Savior? To a Muslim, we were sitting in a tent hearing the story of people. He comes in, starts delivering the message. Some man comes in who's coming to visit the family, has no clue who we are. And you can tell he walks in and looks around. And the pastor looks him straight down. He goes, did you know I was going to be here today? The man goes, nope. And the pastor goes, I didn't know you were going to be here either, but sit down. You couldn't have picked a better day. Today is your day for salvation. And he starts telling him about Jesus. Later on, he says, all right, guys, stand up. All the kids stand up. And you know what he does? He leads a prayer of salvation. And guess who prays after him? That man who walked in. You say, how? Look. It isn't because he was bold in his delivery. It was because for years before, they learned to walk on their knees. They had decided to be set apart. Do you see it? This is the fruit of a life that is positioned vertically, so that you're not sitting there. They have gone through their season of sitting there counting numbers, but they've learned that means nothing in God's economy. You want to impact your world. You trust him to do what you cannot do. You have a Bible study. You give an invitation. One person raises their hand out of 100, and you walk away going, man, that was a bust. Really? For First of all, one person raised their hand. Secondly, you don't know how many things are happening in hearts of people that you haven't even seen. You pray. You pray, you pray. Daniel's secret, by the way, over and over again was that he prayed. Here's number 3. You cannot impact your culture without living a life of persevering faithfulness to God. Persevering faithfulness to God. You cannot quit.
No, you can't.
You must not quit. If you're here and you're like, I'm not sure I'm going to keep going, listen, you cannot quit. Every one of us will want to quit. Satan wants us to quit. So he is after us. If you are living a life where you've dedicated your life to ministry, Satan wants you to quit. Look, we are in the big leagues. You might not feel it. You are in the big leagues. Satan is after you. I don't say this to scare you. This is a Christian environment. Most of you are familiar with God and His Word. He wants us destroyed. We are in a war. Paul talks about it in Ephesians 6. We are in a battle. Well, why are we surprised when the way is hard? So how did Daniel exemplify that? Go to Daniel's chapter 6. They sought to bring him down. By now, he's done well. God's favor is upon him. Listen, if you do well, Satan hates it.
Yes.
He's going to come after you. If you see your ministry's growing, he's surprised that he's coming after you. That's what's going to happen. And they want to come after Daniel. So they come up with this asinine, which is actually not a bad word, but always sounds bad when I say it. They come up with this plan, and guess what? They can only come after Daniel in one thing. He's faithful to his God. If they can bring him down in his faithful prayer life, then they can bring him down. And so they come up with this elaborate, crazy plan, and these men said, chapter 6, verse 5, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Oh, to have a life where that is our biggest problem. I'm ashamed to tell you that is sadly not my story. I spend more, if you were going to tell what is Lina's, I'm growing. But I'm telling you, that would not be my story. It'd be like, I can think of 10 other things that people would say about me, but then I'd be like, well, she's always faithful to God. That's what we hate about her. Think about that. Think about the power of a life where that's your biggest problem. And do you know what Daniel does? See, I'd have been like, today I'm just going to pray in my heart. I'll still pray, but I'm just going to do it quietly. I'm not going to bother anybody. I'm not going to hang the 10 Commandments. I'm not going to put the cross on my chest or whatever it is that you do that is a sign of your... And Daniel does what? Listen. He doesn't do anything more than he's done. It's not like he taunts them. He doesn't go, well, today I'm going to pray out loud. People of Babylon. He doesn't do that. He does what he's always done. This is who he is. He refuses to be cowered into silence. When Daniel knew, verse 10, that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Listen, as he had done previously. You cannot impact your culture without living a life of persevering faithfulness to God. I don't know where you're at in your ministries right now. I don't, but I promise you want success. A long obedience in the right direction or in the same direction. Eugene Peterson said that and wrote a book, by the way, a great book that you ought to get. A long obedience in the right direction. That is true success. Just yesterday I went to speak at this church, and it is the church where, if you knew the story in Inland Hills Church, where the pastor sadly had committed suicide just 8 months ago, and his dad had died of cancer. The founding pastor had died of cancer, and then the son went through depression and ended up killing himself. Well, the founding pastor's wife is still part of the board and very involved in the church, a wonderfully godly woman, and now her daughter-in-law, again, they're walking through this hell. And most people would be like, man, I'm done with the church. Most people would be like, well, I'm going to just visit the church here and there. And yet, listen, Kayla, the wife of the guy who killed himself, she led the charge yesterday. And the mom, over and over again, you know what she said to me? She vetted me. I mean, I was a last-minute decision. The person who was supposed to go couldn't go. And I'm telling you, I've never been vetted. So I was like, dude, I feel like you're trying to see if I'm qualified to date your son. Like what is this? And I'm like, I just want to date. I don't want to marry them, right? And so, but because she cares about her church. But she said to me over and over again, we've learned that faithfulness is the sign of success for the Christian. You keep obeying God in little things, little things, little things, little things, little things that may not look like much to you. But you keep saying yes to God. When He says no for some things that you want, you keep saying yes to Him. When He puts you on hold, delays, you stay faithful. Man, you know who God is. You know His character in your life. And look, that means sometimes you get an Irina or a Heidi who has to remind you, because our hearts forget when we don't have the thing that we want. All we hear is Satan's voice going, man, God's not good enough. God isn't enough for your life. And then you get the voice of truth. You know the voice of truth. Sometimes I need it whispered in my ear. Other times, Irina will attest to that. I need like a 4x4 and banged on my head. This is the world we live in. It's a war. And a war can't be fought alone. We need each other. We need prayer partners.
Yep, we're better together.
We need each other, and we're better together. Thank you. Last thing is this. You cannot impact your culture and not pay a price for it. You cannot impact your culture and not pay a price for it. Listen, if you want to impact your culture, there will be a cost. But here's the good news. Jesus is worth it all. Yeah. Jesus is worth it all. Jesus is worth it all. Yeah. Every desire that you think you want, that doesn't happen in this life, single ladies, you're like, man, I don't know, I've stayed single, I wanted to be married. Jesus is worth it all. Marrieds, you're living your life, you thought your husband would be much more godly by now. Jesus is worth it all. You stay faithful. Listen, your churches, you could make a list of what's wrong with your churches. I know, I've made that list. Jesus is worth it all. You say, how did Daniel pay the price? Here's what I believe. He never went back home. We learned the story of Daniel. Yeah, he had some earthly successes. He rose in the ranks, but he never went back home. Do you know what that means? He never saw his mom again. Think about that. To our knowledge, he lived his life with the Lord, just the two of them. The three leaders, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we don't know how much. We know they were in some contact, but that was his life, some lonely road. I think about the greats. Many of you who are a little older in this room maybe grew up like I did, hearing of the Jim Elliots and the Elizabeth Elliot. She died recently. I'm going through her book now, The Suffering Book. It's an awesome book. If you're going through a difficult season, you've got to get her book on suffering. Man, you think about, those are just the famous ones. You think about the old-fashioned ones. Amy Carmichael, who sat on a bedridden. She had a back injury. And never walked, by the way, never went on furlough, was in India for about 18 years, I believe, with the back injury. God never healed her. She laid on her back. That's where she did most of her writing. You think about David Brainerd, who died at 29. And he never wrote a book. In fact, he had a little measly journal that somebody else found, his potential future father-in-law, who never became his father-in-law because he never married, because he died. Witnessing to a bunch of Indian people up in the middle of nowhere. There are others, William Borden. You make your list, names that could fill books of people who gave everything to Oswald Chambers, who doesn't read My Utmost for His Highest, died, listen, of appendicitis. Of all things, there's a cost to following Jesus. There's a cost. I don't know how it plays out. I don't know how it all happens, but I know this, that it's always worth it when you're living your life to Jesus. I don't think Daniel ever had a moment where he thought, man, I wish I'd done it differently. I don't believe it for a moment. In fact, Daniel saw more revelation in his life about the future. The book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, you know, they're so similar. There's so much prophecy in the book of Daniel. Oh, it was worth it to live a godly life. It was worth it to be set apart, to learn how to pray, to continue in steadfastness, and then to say, God, no matter what happens, no matter what, you are worth it all. I pray that is your story today. I'm going to close this in prayer. I'm here for any conversation. I'm sorry, I meant to do a little Q&A, but then again, I don't often have answers, so it's all good. God, we thank you that you are good and that you are able and that you gave us the strength to continue in this session, even those who so graciously stood and sat. I pray for just an extra blessing on them. And Lord, thank you that you are working in us something right now that only heaven will tell the full story of. Thank you for sisterhood. Thank you for these women, my sisters in Christ. Thank you, God, for the life and legacy you are leaving through them, God. Thank you for their families, their churches, their women, and their ministries. Please, God, give them 100-fold of a harvest. God, help them to see with eyes of faith what you're doing in them as they consider today how they might be set apart, how they might improve in their conversation and prayer with you. And also, Father, give them the resolve to stay faithful no matter what. Father, you are so worth it. We love you from the bottom of our hearts. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Amen.